The dim glow of early morning filtered softly through the slatted blinds of room 5009, casting long shadows over the machines that whispered life into a man who had not spoken a word in half a year. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, sterile and cold, but there was something else too, something warmer, more human. Emily Carter stepped gently into the room, her white sneakers making no sound on the polished floor. In her hands, she carried a small tray, bandages, gauze, warm water, and quiet hope. She wasn't supposed to feel so much. After all, she was only 24, barely 2 years out of nursing school. Just a nurse, they often said, as if compassion could be measured by a degree. But to Emily, this room wasn't just another assignment. It was where she felt most called to be. And Alexander Grant, the man beneath the crisp white sheets, hooked to blinking monitors and breathing through silent machines, wasn't just a patient. He was someone's son, someone's memory, and maybe, just maybe, someone still listening. "Good morning, Alex," she whispered, her voice soft as cotton as she gently began changing his bandages. "You wouldn't believe the mess in the cafeteria this morning. They ran out of coffee again. I nearly rioted, but I figured you'd rather I save that energy for keeping you in one piece." He didn't stir. He never did. But Emily kept talking, her voice threading through the quiet like a lullaby to a man in a deep, unrelenting sleep. She wiped gently at the healing wounds on his arms, careful not to let her fingers linger too long, yet not quite able to help herself either. She told him about the patient in room 5012 who called her Sunshine and about how she missed her father on stormy nights. Others saw only the shell of a man once powerful, now reduced to stillness. But Emily, she believed in things people couldn't see. And every day she came not to wait for a miracle, but to love through the waiting. It was a Tuesday, one of those gray, washed-out afternoons where the sky didn't seem to care much for sunlight. The hospital hummed with routine. Call bells chimed, heels clicked, monitors beeped in steady rhythm, and in room 5009, Emily Carter was humming. She didn't realize it at first. The soft melody she carried on her breath was one her father used to whistle while fixing their leaky kitchen sink. It was just something she did now, a way to fill the sterile air between her words. Emily moved with the precision of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Bandages unwrapped, wounds cleaned, linen smoothed. Alexander's body, though still, had become familiar beneath her hands. She knew the faint scars on his forearms, the way his jaw tightened slightly when she turned him, the fading bruises near his collarbone. And she cared for him like she might a loved one who had drifted far out to sea, but not yet gone. She reached for a fresh gauze pad when it happened. A twitch. Just a twitch. Barely there, the faintest flicker beneath her fingertips. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes snapped to his hands, searching, pleading for confirmation. Nothing. Not a second movement. No fluttering of eyelids. No shift in breath. Emily shook her head slightly, trying to steady her heartbeat. "Probably a muscle spasm," she muttered to herself. "It happens. Just a reflex." Still, as she finished dressing the wound and adjusted the blankets over his chest, a tremor of hope pulsed through her. And that night, even after her shift had long ended and the nurse's station dimmed its lights, she returned. Room 5009 was quiet, the light low and golden. She stood at the threshold for a long moment, just watching him. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe she was imagining things. But maybe, just maybe, something was beginning to change. She stepped in, whispering, "Hey, I'm back. Couldn't sleep. Thought you might miss the sound of my rambling." Alexander didn't move, but the air felt different, charged. Emily walked to his side and gently brushed her fingers across the back of his hand. "If you're in there, Alex, I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here." She sat with him in silence for another hour, her head leaning gently against the bed rail, unaware that her quiet presence, her voice, her faith, was doing something no medicine ever could. Inside Alexander's unconscious world, her words were a thread of light, weaving through the darkness, and he was starting to follow. The next morning, Emily stood outside Dr. Harris's office with a tight knot twisting in her stomach. Her hands were cold despite the warmth of the coffee she clutched, and the clipboard she held against her chest felt heavier than usual. She took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," came the familiar low voice from within. Dr. Harris looked up from his desk, glasses perched low on his nose, a file open before him. His office smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and old books. He motioned for her to sit. "What's on your mind, Emily?" She didn't waste time. "It's Mr. Grant. Yesterday, I think I saw something." Dr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "His fingers," she continued, "they moved. Just a twitch. Small, but deliberate. I know reflexes happen, but this felt different." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You've been on his case a while. It's natural to become hopeful." "It's not just hope," Emily said quickly. "I've seen involuntary movements before. This was more like response, like he was trying to come back." Dr. Harris studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set his pen down and folded his hands. "Emily," he said gently, "I admire your dedication, but sometimes the mind plays tricks. We've seen no significant neurological changes in Mr. Grant's recent scans. These things, they don't just turn around overnight." "But what if they do?" she pressed, her voice laced with quiet urgency. "What if this is the beginning? What if we're wrong to assume he's not in there trying?" Dr. Harris sighed again, this time with more weariness than dismissal. "I'll approve a new EEG. We'll monitor closely, but please, Emily, don't let this consume you." She nodded, even though she already knew she would. From that moment on, Emily's focus sharpened. Every break, every extra minute between her rounds, she spent at Alexander's bedside. She spoke to him about everything, her day, her mother's treatments, the tired ache in her back, the snow starting to fall outside the window. And every day, she looked for another sign. Sometimes she thought she saw it, a flicker of a brow, a twitch in a toe. The other nurses were kind but skeptical. "You've got a good heart, Emily," one said with a smile, "but you can't pour from an empty cup." She didn't answer, because deep down she knew something was happening. One night, a storm rolled through the city, thunder shaking the windows in their frames. Emily stayed late. She always stayed late these days. The hospital was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in your bones. Sitting beside Alexander in the dim light, she held his hand and whispered, "Everyone thinks I'm crazy." She laughed softly, bitterly, "But I know I'm not. Because when I look at you, I don't see someone who's gone. I see someone fighting. I feel it, Alex, I really do." Her voice cracked. And for the first time in a long while, she let the silence sit. And in that silence, with the storm raging outside and tears drying on her cheeks, Emily Carter swore to herself she wouldn't give up. Not until he opened his eyes. The sky outside room 5009 broke with the pale light of morning, casting a golden hue across the white walls. The air inside the room, however, remained unchanged, thick with the low hum of machines and the scent of antiseptic. Emily Carter entered quietly, as she always did. She carried her usual routine in her hands, a warm cup of coffee for herself, a new audiobook queued up on her phone, and a bouquet of daffodils from the market down the street. Alexander had once told her, in a dream, or maybe just in her heart, that he liked daffodils. She placed the flowers in the vase by the window and glanced at him. Same as always, and yet something felt different. She set the coffee down, then approached the bed and gently adjusted the blanket over his chest. She paused, brushing her fingers lightly across his hand. "You missed another storm last night," she whispered with a smile. "You really need to wake up soon, or I'll have to start charging you rent." And then it happened. Just as she reached for his IV line, she froze. His fingers, his actual fingers, curled slowly around hers. Not a twitch, not a spasm. A grip, faint, but intentional. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her heart stopped. Her eyes snapped to his face. And that's when she saw it. Alexander Grant's eyes were open, not just fluttering, not glassy or dazed. Awake, staring straight into hers. Her hands trembled. She reached for the call button, but her gaze never left his. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely speak. "Alex?" she whispered. His eyes followed her every move, slow but sure, blinking once, then twice. Tears welled in her eyes as she rushed to his side, her fingers grasping his hand. "You're back," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You're really back." His lips moved. She leaned closer, holding her breath. He rasped one word, dry and broken, but unmistakable. "Emily." The sound of her name on his lips unraveled her completely. She sobbed, joyful and shaken, pressing her forehead gently to his hand. You remembered me. And in that moment, all the weeks and months of talking to the silence, all the doubt and disbelief from the world outside melted away. Because he had heard her, because he had come back to her, and nothing would ever be the same again. For weeks, room 5009 buzzed with an energy it hadn't known in months. Word of Alexander Grant's awakening spread through St. Clara's private hospital like wildfire. Doctors rotated through with their clipboards and cautious optimism. Specialists were called in, and physical therapists mapped out a rigid routine. Everyone wanted to be part of the miracle. Everyone but Emily, who had already been there when no one else had believed he'd return. It wasn't the fanfare that moved her, it was the way he looked at her, as if his soul remembered hers. On one quiet morning, Emily arrived before her shift officially started. She found Alexander sitting upright in bed, propped by pillows, his eyes scanning a newspaper like he'd done it every day of his life. His hair was a bit messy, his frame still lean and weak from months of stillness, but his gaze was alive. "You're here early," he said, his voice still hoarse but stronger than before. Emily smiled as she walked in. "Couldn't sleep. I figured you'd be up, since you're making reading the Wall Street Journal look like light work." He chuckled, and it sent a wave of warmth through the room. "I used to read this every morning. It's strange what the mind holds on to." She sat beside him, handing him a bottle of water. "You've been through so much, Alex, but you're doing incredible." He looked at her then, with a softness in his eyes. "Only because of you." Emily swallowed. "It was just part of my job." "No," he said firmly, his hand moving to rest lightly over hers. "You talked to me every day, when no one else did, when they had already given up on me." She looked down, unsure of what to say. I didn't want you to feel alone." He tilted his head, his voice dropping lower. "You made me feel alive, even when I couldn't move. I could hear you. I remember the stories. Your dad, the storms, the coffee machine disasters. It got me through." Her heart thudded in her chest. "You saved me," he whispered. She smiled gently, blinking away the tears welling in her eyes. "And you came back." Over the next few weeks, Alexander's recovery unfolded like the turning of seasons. Slow, beautiful, deliberate. His steps were shaky, his balance unsure, but every movement forward was filled with fierce determination. Emily became more than a nurse. She was his confidant, his cheerleader, and the steady voice guiding him through the darkest parts of his rehabilitation. And yet, with every moment shared, a quiet ache built inside them both. There was something unspoken blooming between them. It lingered in the way Alexander's eyes softened when she entered the room, in the way Emily lingered just a bit longer after each visit, in the laughter that escaped easily now, the way his fingers sometimes brushed hers when she adjusted his blanket. One night, as golden light spilled across the hospital floor and bathed the room in a honeyed glow, Emily wheeled Alexander to the small hospital garden, a quiet corner with stone benches and fading roses. The scent of earth and wind drifted through the air. "This feels like the first time I've truly breathed in months," he said, closing his eyes. "Thank you for not giving up on me, Emily." She looked at him, her heart full and aching. It was never even a question. He opened his eyes and held her gaze. "You weren't just keeping me alive in there. You were giving me something to come back to." Their eyes locked. Time slowed, and then for just a moment, Alexander reached forward and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered at her cheek. "Emily," he whispered, "I think I—" He stopped, swallowing hard. She smiled sadly, her voice quiet. "You don't have to say it, not yet." And in that moment, surrounded by silence and shadows, they both knew the truth. This wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something neither of them had planned for, something real. The morning sunlight poured into room 5009, illuminating every corner with a soft golden hue. Emily had just finished adjusting Alexander's pillows, her hands lingering for a moment longer than necessary, her heart still unsure of what to do with the feelings blooming between them. Alexander, now strong enough to sit up and joke about hospital food, had begun to look more and more like the man the world once feared in the boardroom. But behind closed doors, with Emily, he was someone softer, warmer. They were sharing a laugh, Emily telling him about a nurse on the third floor who insisted the hospital coffee was artisan roasted, when the room's door swung open with a force that made both of them turn. The sharp click of high heels on tile followed. "Alexander," a voice rang out like frost on glass. "I see the rumors weren't exaggerated." Emily's smile faltered instantly. She straightened, instinctively taking a step back. Victoria Grant stood at the threshold, impeccable, intimidating, unchanged. Her eyes, the same stormy blue as Alexander's, swept the room with razor precision, landing unforgivingly on Emily. "Mother," Alexander said, already sounding weary, "what are you doing here?" "I should be asking her that," Victoria replied, her tone venomously polite, chin lifted as she stared Emily down. "Tell me, Miss Carter, how long did it take before you realized you could manipulate my son?" Emily's breath hitched, her heart hammering. "Mrs. Grant, with all due respect—" "Oh, please," Victoria cut in, her voice slicing through the air. "Don't insult my intelligence. You latched on to him while he was helpless. Spun your little Florence Nightingale fantasy, and now what? You think you're part of this family?" Alexander's expression darkened. "That's enough." Victoria didn't stop. "You always had a weakness for lost causes," she said, turning to her son. "But this is not love, Alexander. This is gratitude, guilt, confusion. You were in a coma for months. She was there. Of course she feels like she matters." Emily took a shaky breath, her voice small but clear. "I never asked for any of this. I was doing my job." "Then maybe you should have kept it professional," Victoria snapped, "and not personal." The room crackled with tension. Alexander pushed himself up straighter, his voice low but full of fury. "Emily saved my life, not just physically. She brought me back from the edge when no one else even believed I'd wake up." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "And now what? You're going to build a life with her? A nurse? Is that what this is now, Alexander?" Emily couldn't breathe. Her hands trembled at her sides. It was too much, too sharp, too raw. "Is that what you think too?" she asked quietly, her eyes finding Alexander's. He blinked. "Emily, no, of course not." But her heart was already crumbling. "Or maybe this was always about a man clinging to the only hand that was reaching for him," she whispered, her throat tight. "And maybe I let myself believe in something that wasn't real." Alexander tried to rise, his body still weak, but she took a step back, her eyes swimming with tears. "I need to go," she said, her voice cracking. And then she was gone. The door shut softly behind her, and with that, the room was empty again. Not of people, but of everything that had mattered most. The days that followed felt hollow. Room 5009, once a place of quiet warmth, of laughter shared in hushed tones and comfort exchanged without words, now echoed with emptiness. Alexander stared at the ceiling, the same sterile ceiling he'd once prayed to never see again. Now it mocked him. She was gone. No texts, no calls, no presence lingering in the hallway. The chair beside his bed where Emily used to sit and talk about everything and nothing now sat cold and untouched. And somehow that hurt more than the coma had. Harris noticed the shift immediately. Alexander's recovery, once miraculous and swift, began to slow. His appetite dulled, his spirit dimmed. He nodded through therapy but no longer pushed himself. He answered questions with polite detachment. And at night, when no one was around, he'd close his eyes and whisper her name into the silence. Emily. But the silence didn't answer. Only memory did. Her voice, light, melodic, sometimes sarcastic, echoed through his mind in fragments. Her laugh, the way she'd wrinkle her nose when she was focused, the softness of her hand in his. He remembered her eyes most of all, the way they saw him when no one else did. Not the millionaire, not the broken man in a hospital bed. Just him. And now he had no idea where she was. Across the city, in a modest apartment tucked between a laundromat and a grocery store, Emily Carter stood over her kitchen sink, staring blankly out the window as rain drizzled down the glass. She hadn't gone back to St. Clara's. She couldn't. Instead, she transferred quietly to a clinic in another borough. Smaller, quieter, easier to disappear in. She told herself she had done the right thing. That walking away had been noble. That she was protecting herself from heartache, from becoming another name on a list of passing nurses in Alexander Grant's extraordinary life. But when she lay in bed at night, wrapped in the sheets she once came home to with his stories still echoing in her ears, her chest ached. She missed him, the way he smiled when she walked into the room, the way he listened, the way he saw her. And yet, she couldn't go back. He's a millionaire, she reminded herself. His world was never meant to include me. But still, she replayed his voice in her head. You saved me. Again and again, as if saying it enough times might make her believe she deserved to hear it. Alexander tried everything. He asked the hospital staff where she'd gone. No one knew, or maybe they did and were protecting her. He sent messages, no reply. He even left a letter at the front desk in case she ever returned. In it, he'd written only a single line. You're not just the reason I lived. You're the reason I want to live again. Still nothing. So finally, one morning, with the city beginning to thaw into spring, Alexander sat with his assistant and asked quietly, "Can we hold a press conference?" The assistant blinked. For what? Alexander looked out the window, his voice barely above a whisper. For her. The press room buzzed with anticipation. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens poised, cameras trained on the small podium in the center of the room. The invitation had been vague. Just a notice from the Grant Foundation announcing that Alexander Grant would speak publicly for the first time since waking from his coma. The assumptions were easy. Business updates, a new charitable initiative, maybe even a dramatic return to the boardroom. But when Alexander stepped up to the microphone, dressed in a simple navy suit with no entourage at his side, something in the air changed. He didn't bring notes, no prepared statement. Just a quiet steadiness in his step and a storm of emotion in his eyes. He paused, took a breath, and then, in a voice raw and trembling, he began, I know many of you came here expecting news about my company or my recovery, but that's not why I asked you here. He looked straight ahead, not at the sea of journalists, but directly into the camera, into a lens he prayed would carry his words to the only person who mattered. I'm here to talk about someone who saved me. Murmurs rippled through the room, but he didn't stop. Her name is Emily Carter. She was my nurse during the months I spent in a coma. And I don't remember the moment I woke up, but I remember her voice. I remember her stories, her hands, her courage, her kindness. And somewhere in the middle of the silence, I fell in love with her. The room froze. Reporters glanced at each other. Pens stopped scribbling. Alexander's voice cracked, but he kept going. I don't care that she wasn't part of my world before, because she's my world now, and I let her walk away, out of fear, out of pride, out of foolishness. He paused, his throat tightening. His next words were barely more than a whisper. Emily, if you're watching this, I need you to know it was real. What we had, what we still have, it's not gratitude. It's not obligation. It's love. And I can't live another day pretending I'm whole without you. Silence. And then, flashbulbs. Whispers. A single tear slid down Alexander's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. I'll wait, he said, one hand resting on the edge of the podium like it was the only thing holding him up. I'll wait as long as it takes, and with that, he stepped away. No questions, no further comments. Just a man who had built empires, now hoping to rebuild a bridge to one woman's heart. Across the city, Emily Carter sat curled on her couch, an untouched cup of tea cooling in her hand. Her eyes were fixed on the small TV across the room, the remote trembling in her grasp. She had meant to change the channel. She couldn't. She didn't move as Alexander's words poured through the screen, word after word peeling back every wall she had spent weeks trying to build. And when he said, I love you, something inside her shattered. Because she knew now, with absolute clarity, what she should have known from the start. He wasn't the one who let her go. She had walked away, and she couldn't stay away any longer. The city blurred past her in streaks of gray and gold. Emily didn't remember grabbing her coat. She didn't remember the way her trembling fingers fumbled with her keys. All she knew was that she had to move, that if she hesitated even for a second, she might lose him forever. The words he spoke echoed in her mind like a song she couldn't silence. Emily, if you're watching this, it was real. Her heart was thundering in her chest as the cab weaved through traffic. The driver had asked if everything was okay. She hadn't answered. What could she say? She had made the biggest mistake of her life. And now, maybe, just maybe, she had a chance to fix it. The building came into view. St. Clair's. The place that had once felt like a second home now felt like a cathedral of all her memories. Every hallway, every room, every quiet night siding beside his bed, it all rushed back like a flood. She didn't wait for the elevator. Her feet pounded the stairs two at a time, breath ragged, eyes burning. And when she reached the hallway, his hallway, everything else disappeared. He was there, standing just outside the physical therapy wing, leaning slightly on his cane, staring down the corridor as if hoping she'd appear. He turned at the sound of footsteps, and the moment their eyes met, it was as if the entire world went quiet. For one long, suspended breath, neither of them moved. Then, like a dam breaking, Emily ran, straight into his arms. She threw herself against him, arms wrapping around his shoulders, her face buried in his chest as tears poured from her eyes. Her body shook with sobs and laughter all at once. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Alex." He held her like she was the only thing keeping him upright. His cane dropped to the floor with a clatter, forgotten, as he cradled her to his chest. "I thought I lost you," he breathed into her hair. "I thought you were gone for good." "I was scared," she said between gasps. "But I never stopped loving you. I tried to forget. I tried to be logical. But it hurts so much being away from you." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, then "Don't ever leave again." She nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "Never." And then, without waiting, he kissed her. It wasn't the kind of kiss born of passion or desperation. It was the kind that had waded through storms, through silence, through heartbreak. It was the kiss of coming home. Nurses passing by paused and smiled. A few wiped tears from their eyes. Because everyone at that hospital had seen the quiet, steadfast love that had bloomed in room 5009. And now they were watching it take its first breath in the light of day. Later that evening, they sat on a bench in the hospital's rooftop garden, the city lights flickering around them like a sea of stars. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand curled around his. "I watched your press conference," she whispered. He smiled softly. "I meant every word." "I know," she said, "and I needed to hear them." He turned to her, his expression solemn. "Emily, I don't want to waste any more time. I want to build a life with you. Not just the what happens after. I mean the whole thing. Good days, bad days, every messy, beautiful part of it. I want all of it with you." Tears welled in her eyes again. "You have me. All of me." They sat in silence for a while, the cold wind brushing against them. But they didn't feel it. They were warm. Together. 3 months had passed since the moment Emily ran back into Alexander's arms. And yet, to them, it still felt like a miracle every single morning. Gone were the sterile hospital walls, the silence of machines, the tension of wondering if hope was too much to ask. Now their days began with sunlight spilling into a modest home nestled in the green hills just outside the city. It wasn't extravagant, not like the penthouse Alexander once called home, but it had a garden, a porch swing, a little winding path that led down to a pond where dragonflies danced over the water in the summer. It was, in every way, enough. Alexander had stepped away from the whirlwind world of corporate takeovers and boardroom battles. He still had his wealth, of course, and his name carried weight, but he no longer used it to build empires. He used it to rebuild people. With Emily's help, he launched the Grant Foundation for Compassionate Care, a nonprofit organization that funded scholarships for nursing students, paid hospital bills for low-income families, and provided therapy programs for long-term care patients who, like him, had once been lost in silence. Emily, ever the caregiver, now split her time between managing a community clinic in the inner city and mentoring young nurses just starting out. She was a living, breathing reminder that hope was never wasted, not even when the world seemed determined to crush it. And though their new life was full of purpose and giving, the most sacred part of it was the life they were building together. Each morning, Alexander would sit on the edge of the porch swing, coffee in hand, as Emily watered the garden barefoot, her hair a mess of curls and sunlight. He never tired of watching her, of knowing she had chosen him, not because of what he had, but because of who he was beneath it all. They shared laughter over burnt pancakes. They argued gently about what color to paint the guest bedroom. They kissed when no one was watching, and when everyone was. Some nights after long shifts and longer meetings, they'd fall asleep on the couch, tangled in each other's arms, the television still playing soft classical music, and the scent of lavender drifting from the window. But it wasn't perfect. Some days the pain in Alexander's legs flared up and made it hard to walk. Some days Emily would cry in the bathroom, overwhelmed by memories of her mother's final months in the hospital. And yet, through it all, they stayed. They chose each other again and again. One quiet Saturday, as rain tapped against the windows and a fire crackled in the hearth, Alexander turned to Emily with a soft smile. "You remember the first time I opened my eyes and saw you?" he asked. She chuckled, curled up beside him under a blanket. "You scared the life out of me." He laughed too. "I was terrified you'd be gone when I blinked again." Emily shifted closer, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady thump of the heart she'd fought so hard to protect. "You saved me," he whispered, brushing her hair back. "Not just my life. You saved the parts of me I thought were gone forever." Well, she looked up at him, her eyes full of love. "You saved me too." And in that quiet moment, no cameras, no headlines, no applause. They knew. This was the miracle they had been waiting for. The chapel was nothing like the ornate halls of the Grant family's elite gatherings. No golden chandeliers, no string quartets flown in from Europe. Instead, it sat quietly on a hill, overlooking a patchwork of wildflowers and trees that had begun to blush with the colors of autumn. It was small, simple, and perfect. The morning sun filtered softly through stained glass windows, casting warm hues of blue and rose onto the pews filled with people who had stood beside Emily and Alexander through every storm. Nurses, patients, friends from the foundation, and even Dr. Harris, who now looked at Alexander with something akin to pride. Alexander stood at the altar, nervous, his hands clasped before him. He wore a dark blue suit, hand-stitched by a local tailor. Not flashy, just honest, and perfectly him. His hair was a little longer now, peppered with a touch more gray, but his eyes, they still carried that same quiet fire that had first returned when Emily whispered to him in the hospital bed. The soft music began to swell, and the wooden chapel doors creaked open. And then there she was, Emily. She didn't wear $1,000 gown. She didn't glide down the aisle like someone on the cover of a magazine. She walked, steadily, gently, her eyes never leaving his, as if each step was a promise. Her dress was ivory lace, fitted close to her frame, the hem brushing just above the tops of her shoes. Her hair fell in soft waves, pinned loosely with a few tiny flowers from the garden they had planted together. But it wasn't what she wore. It was the way Alexander looked at her, as if she was the answer to every prayer he never had the courage to speak aloud. As she reached the altar, they stood for a moment, just breathing. No words, just knowing. The minister's voice trembled slightly as he began. He spoke not of perfection, but of perseverance. Not of fairy tales, but of hard-earned hope. And when it came time for the vows, they didn't read from cards. They just spoke, from the soul. "Emily," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion, "you met me at my lowest, and you didn't look away. You stayed when you had every reason to walk. You reminded me I was still human, still worthy of love. Today I don't just marry you, I thank you. For saving me, for choosing me, for loving me when I couldn't love myself." Emily's hand trembled slightly as she reached up to wipe a tear from his cheek. Then she spoke. "Alex, I thought I knew what love looked like. But it wasn't until I sat beside your hospital bed, whispering to someone who couldn't answer, that I understood what it really meant. It's not grand gestures or perfect moments. It's presence, faith, holding someone's hand even when you don't know if they'll ever hold yours back. I'm yours now and always." The chapel fell silent as the minister smiled. "By the power vested in me, and with the grace that love has granted us all, Alexander Grant and Emily Carter, I now pronounce you husband and wife." There was no eruption of applause, just a soft rustle, a gentle exhale from the crowd as Alexander leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss born of passion alone. It was gratitude. It was promise. It was peace. Later, at the small reception under a tent beside the chapel, they danced to a song no one recognized, but everyone felt. The cake was homemade. The speeches were awkward and heartfelt. Noah, now a young man in college, stood up and raised his glass with tears in his eyes. "My dad didn't just come back to life," he said, voice shaking. "He found love. And Emily, thank you for giving me my father back." Emily wept openly. Alexander squeezed her hand, and she knew this was only the beginning. Their wedding wasn't featured in a magazine. There were no exclusive interviews, no paparazzi. But in the hearts of those who had watched their journey unfold, it was unforgettable. Two broken people who found wholeness not in riches or fame, but in the quiet act of never giving up. There were no trumpets announcing their new life. No fanfare, just the quiet hum of morning sunlight spilling through white curtains and the slow, familiar rhythm of two hearts learning to beat as one. Their home wasn't a mansion. It was a white farmhouse tucked at the edge of a sleepy town where the trees bowed gently in the wind and the neighbors waved from their porches. The mailbox read Grant and Carter in crooked, hand-painted letters because Alexander had insisted they do it themselves, and Emily had laughed the entire time. The mornings were simple: coffee, scrambled eggs, the soft creak of old floorboards. Alexander would read the paper aloud in a voice that still cracked slightly from the coma, while Emily curled up beside him with her notebook, planning her week at the clinic. Their days weren't filled with power lunches or stock reports anymore. They were filled with purpose and love. The clinic Emily ran became a haven for single mothers, struggling families, and people who had lost hope in the healthcare system. Her patients didn't just see a nurse. They saw a woman who listened, who remembered their names, who once sat beside a bed for 6 months believing in the impossible. Alexander didn't return to the corporate world. Instead, he founded a foundation, the Carter Grant Initiative, focused on supporting community health centers, education programs, and shelters. Every check he signed had a handwritten note at the bottom: "Keep going. Someone believes in you." On quiet afternoons, they would sit on the porch swing, hand in hand, watching the clouds drift by. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't need to. Emily often caught herself looking at him, still amazed, not because of who he had been, but because of who he chose to become. A man who had traded boardrooms for beanbags in her clinic's playroom. A man who still cried when he read thank you letters from patients they had helped. A man who loved her deeply and told her every single day. One fall evening, as the leaves whispered in shades of gold and copper, Emily stood in the garden behind their house, watching the sun melt into the hills. Alexander stepped outside, 2 mugs of cider in his hands. He handed her one, brushed her hair back behind her ear, and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She glanced at him, eyes soft. "How far we've come." He nodded, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "From room 5009 to this." They fell into silence. Then Emily turned to him, her voice trembling just a little. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had walked away?" Alexander took a breath. "No," he said softly, "because I know you never would have. That's the kind of woman you are." She looked away, blinking back tears. And then he said something that made her heart stutter. "You didn't just save my life, Em. You gave me one worth waking up to." Years passed. They grew older. Lines deepened around their eyes from too much laughter, not sorrow. Their hair grayed, their walks grew slower. But their love, that only grew stronger. Noah graduated, started a family of his own. Every Sunday, they gathered around the same wooden table, plates full, hearts fuller. There were photos now, on the walls, on the fridge, on the bedside table. One of them was framed in the entryway, a nurse in scrubs holding the hand of a man just learning how to walk again. It was their beginning, but not their best chapter, because that, they believed, was always still to come. The lesson: this isn't a story about a nurse and a millionaire. This is a story about faith, about the power of showing up every day even when there's no sign of progress, about speaking to someone who can't respond and believing that your words still matter, about second chances, about not letting wealth or class or pride keep you from reaching for love. It's about presence, because sometimes the greatest thing you can give someone isn't medicine or money. It's the simple, quiet miracle of not giving up on them. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and tell us what part stayed with you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories, where we tell tales that bring warmth to your heart, remind you of the goodness in people, and inspire hope in the simplest acts. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story that might just change your day or your life. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and believe in love, even when it comes softly.